Welcome to the Justice in Heels podcast. I'm your host, Danielle Hayward, and I'm thrilled to have you join us for season 4 of the podcast. This season will focus on compliance-related topics, and the goal is to simplify compliance for business owners. Let's get started. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Justice in Heels podcast. In this season, we are dealing with compliance-related issues, and today I have Robin Shepherd joining me. She is somebody that I've had on the podcast before. And welcome, Robin. I'm so happy to have you on the podcast again.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to discuss what we're discussing today.
Fabulous. Okay, so for those who haven't listened to the previous seasons and may not know who you are, can you maybe just give them a short introduction? Who is Robin? What is she passionate about?
Awesome. I'll do so. I'm Robin. I work at Schoeman Law Incorporated based in Cape Town. I am a senior associate and I am passionate about a number of things, law being one, but also storytelling with law. I'm really passionate about that. And my interests pretty much cross-merge. I enjoy good, family law. I enjoy tech law, social media law. So I try and merge that together. That's something that I'm really, really passionate about. And that really goes back down to just connection, human connection, and how law can help, through that when there's an issue, of course. So that's me in a nutshell.
Lovely. Okay, so today's topic is going to be the POPIA Act, which I think is like a very hot topic at the moment. I think there's a lot of misconceptions regarding the POPIA Act. So maybe I think before we start, maybe just give an introduction. What is the POPIA Act? When was it enacted? And why was it enacted?
So the POPIA Act stands for the Protection of Personal Information Act, and it's essentially South Africa's main privacy and data protection law. And this came about, of course, because our world is ever changing. It's changed dramatically in the way we use information. And if you think about it, every time we shop online, subscribe to a newsletter, or even when we sign up for Wi-Fi at a coffee shop, right? We are handing over bits and pieces of ourselves, whether that's your name, your phone number, your ID number sometimes, or sometimes you even have to hand over your banking details or even your location. And before this act, there wasn't much consistent legal framework around that or controlling how information could be collected or concealed or shared or sold. And this was really enacted and introduced to give people that control over their own personal information. And it's also to force organizations, whether that is private companies, public bodies, or even individuals, to handle information that is, of course, handled in a responsible manner. So it is built on, a few key principles. It's built on transparency, accountability, consent, and then, of course, security. So that's really the act in a nutshell. And it is, as you mentioned, a hot topic. Of course, the world we live in has, of course, dramatically changed. So this is a great act to protect your own personal information when you are engaging in any online sort of transaction.
Okay, so you've mentioned personal information quite a lot when answering the previous question. Maybe just tell our listeners what exactly is personal information in the simplest of terms.
So in short, it's any information that can identify a person, whether that's directly or indirectly. So of course, it includes a few obvious things. That's your name, your surname, your ID number, your contact details, or your address. But it can also include more subtle information. For example, it could be your race, your gender, your age, even your medical history, education, anything that is personal to you, but it can also include your biometric data, such as fingerprints or facial recognition. And that's why it's important to remember that it doesn't just apply to customers, but it also includes your employees, your suppliers, and any website visitors. So that, in a nutshell, is what personal information includes. It sounds straightforward, but I think the Act defines it in a very broad definition.
Definitely. And I think what many people don't know is that personal information can also include things like preferences. Like when you give Facebook like you confirm, you give them the authority to take into account all of your preferences that you have, maybe for the type of ads that they show you. So that's also an interesting one. Like you said, it sounds straightforward, but it can get quite complex, and there's so
Mm,
much personal information that we don't even understand or realize that we're actually
mm,
sharing.
of
Quite
course.
scary.
Yes.
So, what would you say is the biggest, let's say, top three mistakes that small businesses make when they are actually dealing with the POPI Act?
So the first is treating the act as if it is I would describe it a once-off project, right? Something to get done and to tick off in terms of a list. And I think small businesses might put together a privacy policy and an email disclaimer, and then they never think of it again. But of course, it's ongoing. Businesses change, staff change, and so do the risks. And this act requires you to continuously monitor the circumstances and update how you handle the information. So I would say that is mistake one. Mistake two is, of course, forgetting about their staff. And often a data breach doesn't happen because of a hacker, which we often think of. It does happen because someone has maybe emailed the wrong document or left the laptop unlocked or uploaded client data to a personal drive, and therefore training gets disregarded. And with training, of course, that becomes your strongest or your weakest, rather your weakest link if you don't train your staff accordingly. And then the third mistake I would say is collecting, of course, too much data. Businesses love data, but the act is clear. It's to only collect what is necessary for your purpose. So it's not necessary to hold on to copies of IDs and pay slips or CVs just for in case. The more data you have, the more responsible you are, of course, for protecting that data. So it really is about being careful with the kind of information you have, and the information you do have is to, of course, protect it and really monitor how you keep up to date with that information that you have collected.
So, something that I also hear a lot of people saying is that, POPI compliance and compliance in general is just for like these big corporations, and the small businesses don't really need to comply. So, what would your comment be on somebody saying that?
Hmm. I definitely think it's a big misconception I come across. The Act really applies to anybody who processes personal information, and that can be from a multinational company to a one-person business. And if you run a small business, you have to think about how often, again, you collect that personal information when clients send you their details for a quote, or when you issue invoices, or when you run social media ads or newsletters. Every one of those actions involve processing data. Therefore, the Act applies. So I think for many small businesses, they might feel intimidated because the law sounds technical, and compliance, it doesn't really need to be that expensive or complicated. And it's not only for the big corporates, it really is for anybody that is, of course, processing information.
Yeah, I can't agree more with that. So then risks. Let's talk about risks. What risks do you see, and what type of penalties are there if companies do not actually abide by all of these POPI regulations?
Mm. So, of course, there's legal risks and, of course, reputational risks as well. And from a legal point of view, there are certain criminal charges one can face, for example, whether there's been a deliberate misuse of data or really reckless handling of data, you can be issued a fine up to 10 million rand. But beyond the legal side, which I've mentioned, there's also a reputational risk. And that I think is often a much greater risk. Of course, once word gets out and, we can think of it in a logical sense. Once word gets out that a business has its data being leaked or it's mishandled client information, which is sensitive information, that trust ultimately is broken. And in today's world, information or news rather, it spreads really fast online, and that damage can take years to rebuild, if at all. So it is really important, again, as I've mentioned, to handle that personal data as if you are a custodian of someone's privacy. And of course, failing to protect it, it isn't just bad for business, but it is, of course, also unethical. So it can have, of course, legal implications and legal risks, but definitely reputational risks as well.
And how often in practice do you actually see people getting these big penalties or these big fines for not complying?
Mm. So, of course, you see it often, and unfortunately, I think it goes back to corporates or small businesses not keeping up to date with the compliance side of what is required. And unfortunately, it takes a bit of a hit, it takes a reputational hit rather than a legal hit to really understand the gravity of this act and how it can really damage a client relationship. So I've seen it quite often, and unfortunately, it's the lack of knowledge of what the act can do for you.
Hmm, definitely. Okay, so I mean, we live in a time basically where a lot of companies are not performing all of their functions on their own. They're outsourcing a lot. So what do you think these companies should look at when they are actually contracting with third party agencies like HR firms, for example, or even software firms, anything like that?
Mm-mm. So if, of course, you're using a third-party provider, you mentioned a payroll company, or even an external marketing agency, which is, quite the rage at the moment. Of course, you're sharing personal information with them. And those are what you call operators under the Act. And they or you, rather, as a responsible party, must ensure that your third party service provider also comply with the Act. And I would advise the best way to do this is to, of course, have a written agreement. And that document will, of course, clearly state how that information will be protected and what security measures they will use and what will happen if there is a breach of data and of course, what information they can and can't use. So, of course, if something goes wrong on their side, the information regulator will still look at you first and not them. So you can't just rely on oh, but we didn't know situation. The act, of course, expects you to do your due diligence. So I like to tell clients you need to think of it as extending your security perimeter. If somebody touches your client's data, they, of course, become a part of your compliance ecosystem as a whole.
So you've mentioned the information regulator now. I think we should maybe just expand a bit on the function of an information officer, deputy information officer, appointing them at the information regulator, and what their responsibilities are, if you don't mind expanding on that.
Sure, no problem. This is, of course, a very important part of compliance and one that many businesses perhaps overlook or misunderstand. And for every organization, whether that is a privacy company, a government department, or an NGO, you must have an information officer. And this person essentially is the face of compliance within that organization. They are responsible for ensuring that the business complies with the Act, develops internal policies, responds to any data access requests, and they, of course, engage with the information regulator if there is any breach or any complaint. And in terms of the appointment, the Act designates the head of the organization as the information officer. And in a company, that'll either be the CEO or the managing director. In a partnership, it's the managing partner. And of course, in a public body, that is the head of the institution. However, of course, those individuals can delegate those day-to-day duties to someone else. And that is, of course, who we call a deputy information officer. So those are two really important individuals within a business.
Thank you for that. Very helpful. Then my last question to you is, if you had the power to change one thing about the POPI Act to make it more accessible or just less painful to actually enforce, what would that thing be?
I would make it more practical. I would make it more accessible, especially for small and medium businesses. I think the law is strong and necessary, but it is written in legal language that I think can be quite intimidating for some people. I would, of course, like to see the information regulator release more user-friendly templates, some industry-specific guidelines and checklists. And I think definitely more public education, talks like this, of this nature, just educating the general public. Privacy, it shouldn't only be understood between lawyers or IT specialists. It really is a basic right. And I think if business owners and consumers understood what the law really stands for, I think compliance would then form part of the culture and it wouldn't feel necessarily like a chore.
Fantastic. Robin, thank you so much again for joining me on the podcast. It was really so much fun. And I look forward to having you on the podcast again.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed the discussion a lot. Thank you.
Where can our listeners reach you?
You can reach me at Skuman Law. So you can find us on our website, of course, or you could find me personally on my own LinkedIn. It is Robin Shepherd, and all my work is there. Of course, what I do for my firm, but also what I do on a personal level. So you can definitely reach me on my LinkedIn at Robin Shepherd.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Justice in Heels podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, feel free to share it with your friends on social media and tag us. As this podcast has a legal element, just a quick disclaimer that all views expressed in this podcast are not necessarily the views of the firms, companies, or brands that we are associated with. Until next time, goodbye.